Thanks for joining us today, and welcome to today's Criterion learning series on overtime rules. And today we are covering actually a very complex configuration because there are so many different overtime rules for different scenarios, daily, weekly, monthly, and other frequencies, different days of the week, different times, and things like that. I'm going to try to cover as many overtime configurations as I can in the system. Of course, I'll set the ground rules with it, and then we'll talk about those things. This is one of those topics where you definitely can reach out to our support team, obviously implementation team, if you have questions on overtime rules, because there can be a lot of different rules depending on, of course, your location, maybe your union or not, or things like that. So I'm going to do my best to cover as much as I can. And if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A, and we'll do our best to answer those questions. So we'll monitor those. And without further ado, let me go ahead and switch my screen here to my browser. All right, so you should be able to see my browser here. Let me make it a little bit bigger. So give me 1 second here. It just looks better that way. All right, so I'm going to show you on a timesheet here where eventually we'll calculate. So we will come back here. In fact, let me just open up a timesheet so you get an idea of where we're looking at these calculations here. I'll go to this current timesheet here for this employee, and you'll see an example right away of some overtime today. He has 1 hour and 45 minutes of overtime today. So you can kind of see how the system shows that total. He has 2 hours and 45 minutes for the week. So you get an idea of what that looks like in the system. But how does it calculate that? Of course, that's going to be configuration. And so we're going to go ahead and cover this a little bit in the system. So we're going to jump right over to incomes, because you do need to set up your incomes before you can have any calculations happening for overtime. Now, what you name your incomes, of course, is configurable to whatever your situation is. So you'll see a whole bunch of incomes in my settings here, but I'm going to just look at a couple of them to give you an idea. So first off, I'm going to look at the regular hours. So the hours that are not overtime, the ones where people are going to be clocking in and out of possibly, or entering in onto their timesheet. So you may notice this description here matches what I was just looking at on my timesheet. I call it regular pay. You could call this hours or regular hours or worked hours or something like that. Really up to you on what you want to call it. This is one of the key things right here, is making sure that any income code that's hourly and is eligible for overtime has this checkbox turned on. So, or checked like mine is here. So if you do have something that is not part of overtime, let's say for an example, holiday pay, time off, maybe there's on-call pay, travel time, whatever it might be that you do not pay overtime on, depending on your situation, you'll want to make sure this is not checked. So the system does not include that in your overtime calculation. So that's very key setting in here on those codes that are part of the calculation overtime. Make sure this is checked off on those. All right. And then the income code you're going to use to actually pay out the overtime. I'll give you an example of one of these. So here I have one called overtime. Of course, I'm not going to calculate overtime on overtime. So that's not part of the calculation here. And you'll see here, I have a multiplier of 1.5 for this. So it'll take the pay rate times 1.5. Somebody's getting paid $10 an hour, it'll pay them $15 an hour as an example. So you can go ahead and put that in there. Now, you may want to say you're going to exclude it from certain things. That's a different setting. We can talk about that, or you can ask support about that. But those are the keys, of course, in here. The description, you'll need to remember that, because when you go to configure your rules and how you calculate it, you're going to choose the code, the income code you're going to pay out. And so you'll want to set these up ahead of time, because you can't set up overtime unless these are actually set up in the system. All right, and you can have other ones. You might have the double time. Maybe you've got comp time, or I don't know, triple time, or holiday overtime, with different codes that you wanted to set up. Go ahead and set those up in here, and then you can go ahead and use that on your employee screen, or on your overtime setup. So let's look at overtime rules. I'm going to leave this screen open, but just in case you're not sure where it is under system administration. Of course, if you're not exactly sure, you can't remember, you can just start typing overtime as an example, and you'll see it right there. I have this tab already open, so I can switch back and forth. And so here you'll see I have some rules already configured in my system. I'll go over a couple of these so you can get an idea of what they look like. So here's a daily overtime calculation. Now the name does not need to be called daily overtime. It could be called whatever you like to call it. I prefer to have the description at least explain what this is all about. So there's no question if you do have multiple rules, which one is which. If you simply called everything overtime, and then you want to go set up the work locations and those types of things, it might be very confusing to you if you don't have that clarity of, is this daily, is it weekly or semi-monthly, whatever it is your rule is. So I recommend a description that is descriptive of what's going on. All right, comp time is an optional setting here that you could turn on. What that would do would mean it's going to take any overtime that's calculated, and rather than paying it out immediately, it would put it into a comp time plan. Now, I'm not going to get into all the details of that in this particular one because that is actually probably its own separate topic. But if you do have that, some people refer to this as in lieu of time. So in lieu of getting overtime, they're getting this banked into the time off bucket. So this enables that right there. Auto deduct. So you'll see right here, auto deduct breaks. Now, this is something that the system can deduct a break for the employees. It's on the timesheet setup where you would configure that. But let's say you want to auto deduct their lunch break, 30-minute lunch break. You can have the system do that as part of the overtime rules. That's where the configuration happens. You would check this box, and then it would auto deduct those breaks from the employee's timesheet. So that's an option there. You don't need to enable that. All right, the employee group or groups that this applies to. Now, this you'll notice also is an optional field because maybe you need to set up your overtime rules on each work location. So be aware of that. You might set it up on the work location and not have employee groups, but you can use a combination. It could be a group of employees at a work location. So it's an option on how you have that work there. Mine is set to all active employees. Of course, the employee groups, in case you're not familiar with where those are configured, HR administration employee groups. All right. And before I get down here, I do want to note, we do have this up here, enhanced settings, that you may need to configure depending on whatever it is. So here you'll notice I have a meal waiver, a meal period calculation configured right here, and including a meal waiver. So this is an option here. You'll see these different things. And again, I may not have enough time to cover all these things, but this might be helpful for you. So as an example of a meal configuration, in my situation, the employee must take a meal break after 5 hours. So this is in minutes. Now, there is help on this to get real clarity on this, but this is basically saying, look for the income code called lunch. If it doesn't happen before 301 minutes, the person gets 30 minutes of lunch. If that doesn't happen before 360 minutes or 6 hours, they would get this, and we would also get the 30 minutes, but it gets, excuse me, they get the lunch punch or lunch penalty here added. That's what LP is in my situation. There's an income code called lunch penalty. It's LP. Your coding may be different. Maybe you might call this meal, and this is missed meal or something, MM or whatever. But this is the income code here. And then this is the second one saying at 601 minutes, so 10 hours and 1 minute. If they haven't taken a lunch break, that's 30 minutes. And if they don't take it before 12 hours, we also do the lunch penalty. So this can be configured here. I would say if you have any questions on this, speak with implementation or support. We're happy to answer those questions, but that's what that is, a very high level of how that works. You'll see other things in here, for example, split shifts, and you can build those in here, shift spreads and makeup time. These are all options that you can enable. You'll notice once I turn those on there, you have to put a formula in. It's now a required field. Of course, if I don't check the box, I don't need to spit that in there. So in split shift, that's a rule where perhaps they get they work and then there's a gap of time between shifts. It needs to be a minimum gap of time. That's what the split shift would be in there. So they maybe get a bump up of $1 an hour or something like that. The shift spread, so if the start time to end time is over a certain amount of time, maybe they get a bump up in pay. They get a penalty on that. So that would be in there. And then makeup time is another one where perhaps they can make up for um, missing time by working extra time on a certain day. So maybe they have that option there. Maybe the union or something like that has given that option where you can work 10 hours on Monday to take off 2 hours early on Friday and not have it count as overtime. So different options out there. And if you do have any of these things, again, we ask that you reach out to us and we can help you out that. I see there is a question out there specifically about a California pay rule, and I know Connor's answering that. We might need to reach out to you and discuss that individually. But please reach out to us, help@criterionhcm.com. All right, so here you'll see some examples of how this works here. And the sequence matters. So you will want to make sure you have this in the right sequence here. In my example here, I actually have 3 rules that apply. So first off, what I'm calling early in. So somebody comes in early. The formula here is time between. So time between midnight and 8 a.m. is considered overtime using this code called early in. So perhaps they get something extra because they came in early. They were called in early or something like that. Here you'll notice this is a one where I actually have 3 rules in one separated by a comma. So any hours over 8 in a day, that's what greater than day over 8. Any hours on the 7th day in a row is greater than 0. It's going to be overtime. And any hours over 40 in a week are going to be overtime. So you can stack these on how this works. Now, what this means, though, is it's not going to double count them. So in other words, let's say they work 10 hours per day, 5 days. They're not going to get overtime because it's over 8 and overtime because it's over 40. It'll just calculate one time that overtime rule. All right, so that always works, and there's nothing special you need to do. That's just how that works. And then here I have double time, which is anything over 12 in a day, or anything over 8 hours on the 7th day in a row. Now, I'll talk about some of the other things that can be in here. Perhaps there's overtime over 8 hours on Friday. You can use codes for the different days for that. It could be FRI greater than 8, and it would look at that. So if you do have certain rules around different days of the week and things, we can accommodate those. Again, I'd say reach out to us on that. Let me show you another example of just a weekly overtime. So this is anything over 40 in a week is overtime. All right, and then here you'll see monthly over 120 hours. So different options out there to handle various scenarios. Let me show you the comp time one just so you can kind of see what this looks like. There's a comp time one for the group of employees called comp time eligible, and it goes into these 2 different banks based off of the hours. All right, so just some examples for how that might work there. Okay, so once you have these configured, now you will notice this one right here is what we refer to as the aggregate rule. This is necessary if you have several work locations and they have different overtime rules. So perhaps you're in multiple states, or within a state, there's different jurisdictions that have different time frames, or in a province, there's one province is different than another, and you have folks traveling between. Now, if nobody ever travels between, I would say still set it up, but it probably will never come into play. But this tells you, what do you do if they do work between multiple, and maybe you say, well, they get daily over 8, but they also have this federal rule that is any hours over 40. And that might be different for different states or provinces or something like that. So that aggregate rule comes into play, and you'll see mine here is weekly over 40. But you will need this one here with the code star for aggregate. So let's talk about work locations and where that is configured. So work locations are here under HR administration. You'll see work locations. Again, work locations. Now, if you just have one work location, you're certainly welcome to put the overtime rule you have on there if you only have one overtime rule. But this is very useful. Let's say you're in multiple states, like I am right here. You might say, in San Diego, we have this daily overtime rule. And in Dallas, we have a weekly overtime rule. And in Austin, there's another one. So you can have different rules for different locations and how that would work. Now, as I mentioned, you do want to have that aggregate rule in place so that it will handle those situations where maybe you didn't set up a work location with an overtime rule, or they are working in multiple locations, and how do we handle those hours that are maybe over 40, but they're not counted as overtime, whatever the rules happen to be. That's kind of what that is for that situation. All right, so we do want to have that aggregate. The aggregate rule doesn't get assigned to a work location. It just sits there to kind of collect the hours that maybe we need to make sure we get covered. All right, so you can set up the various locations with overtime rules. Now, when you do that, of course, if you let's say you change the rules like I just did, I changed Dallas to weekly from daily, and I changed San Diego from weekly or daily to weekly or whatever it was. I will want to recalculate. The system will not go back and like say, oh, well, you changed your rules, and 3 pay periods ago, the rule change here. We don't go like retroactively looking at overtime like that. We're looking at the current period and when you bring the hours into payroll and stuff like that. But we don't go back if you change your rules and recalculate the payroll. All right, so that's work locations there. I do want to point out on the employee, we are going to look at exempt as well as the groups that they are in. So this is an important one here. If somebody is marked as exempt, they're exempt from overtime. So you might be pulling your hair out saying, why is Gary not getting overtime? He's got 100 hours on there and I don't understand what's going on. I know he's hourly, he's in the right group, everything seems right. If you come to the position screen and you notice this exempt box is checked, he's going to not get the overtime. So just be aware of that checkbox that is not checked for somebody you're expecting to have overtime. All right, so unchecked is non-exempt. That's the terminology there. And finally, I do want to mention the groups. I'll go to the work locations in a second, but I do want to mention the groups here. So you will want to make sure that they are in the appropriate group. Now, I have some that are dynamically calculated. You'll notice the ones that do not have a trash can are dynamically calculated. So he's automatically in this all employees and hourly and so forth. So if one of the overtime rules is, let's say for all active employees, I don't need to add him to that. In fact, I won't even have the option because it's a dynamic group. However, if I do have perhaps a specific group, maybe a certain union or something like that, that I create, and it's not dynamically created, you will want to add them to that. So that could be another reason why somebody's overtime is not calculating. Check the groups to make sure. And I think you'll realize why I'm saying these things because I've had to deal with this myself. I run into things saying, why isn't overtime working? And it's because the employee maybe is not set up the way you're expecting them to be set up. Of course, the work location does matter here. If they are in several, they would get the choice on their timesheet, and then I would apply to their overtime rules. So I've got 3 different ones. You'll notice San Diego is not there, so that daily one wouldn't apply. But these would be options now on his timesheet. All right, so let's look at the timesheet again. Now, you recall I did change something for this employee. So when I hit save here, it will probably recalculate depending on whatever the situation is. I don't remember which one was San Diego, if it was headquarters or not, but you'll see here, yeah, I do have that calculation of the overtime on here and it's calculating this. Here is the meal break. Now, I do want to clarify, if we do have any folks here from California, or perhaps somebody's listening who wasn't here live, the lunch break requires a lunch punch. So simply because I put a gap in here, as you'll notice here, 8 to 11 and 12 to 1:45, that doesn't mean that there was a lunch break as far as our context of lunch. What it means is that person actually clocked in and out of the lunch pay code. So that would be how the system determines that there was a lunch for this employee. So for an example, if I clock in right now, just let this run for a minute, I do have this option here for out lunch and out day. Now, this is also a configuration thing that you do need to configure in your system, not just the overtime rule, but what code is it for lunch on the timesheet. So I'll show you on the timesheet layout where that's set up. And this is why I said it's so complex, because many of the other things we've looked at in training in the past, we've gone to, maybe just one screen. Here, of course, it's all over the place because there's a lot of complexity in overtime. It's very important that it is set up in different places. So here's the timesheet layout I was just looking at. And when I come down here, there is my break configuration. So recall lunch being the rule in the overtime meal calculation. That's where this is looking at that. Minimum elapsed is something where you can say, don't even show the option to take lunch until they have worked a minimum number of minutes or hours in the day. So if somebody can't take a lunch break until they've worked 2 hours, you can put 2H here, and that would mean 2 hours. All right, in my situation, 5M is 5 minutes. They have to work at least 5 minutes for them to see the lunch out button. Here you'll see a notification for notification after minimum elapsed. So after 30 minutes, I can have the system send a notification to the employee that they need to take a lunch. Probably not 30 minutes, but definitely let's say you're in California, somebody has to take the lunch before the 5th hour. Maybe you send something at the 4th hour, something like that to say you need to take a lunch. So you might want to have that there. All right, you'll see this is optional. You don't need to send a notification, but you can. This is how long the break should be, 30 minutes. This is where that auto break would take 30 minutes if you were using that rule. So it would look at this and say, oh, it should be 30 minutes, and it would do a 30-minute lunch break for this person. And then here's the minimum return. So if you force your employees to take at least 30 minutes, when they go to use the clock or the mobile app, they will not be able to clock in unless that lunch period from the start of lunch to the current time has been 30 minutes, or in my situation, 1 minute. I would not be able to return from lunch right away. I have to go for at least 1 minute. So this would allow you to kind of lock them out of the clock so they don't take too short of a lunch, in a situation. Now, of course, you could call them back, in which case you can override what the system does. You can't do it at the clock level, but you could have them clock in, and then you could change it to a shorter time frame if you needed to. All right, all that being said, when I go back here, you'll see this is out lunch. Now, this is using the description for the break. So if you set up various breaks, maybe you do, a coffee break after 2 hours and a lunch break after 4 and a snack break at 6 hours, whatever you may want to call them. This little label here where it says out lunch would say out coffee, out snack, out lunch. So now I've done the lunch. Here you go. You see how it automatically stopped this one at 12:22. It started the lunch at 12:22. And then when I return and I come in, 30 minutes, depending on how you have that minimum set up, you'll see right there that would stop the lunch and start a regular punch. All right. Now, if I'm just saying, well, I'm leaving for the end of the day, my boss told me to leave and there's no more work for me today, I can still clock out for lunch or for the day, excuse me. Now, this also shows if I go to the menu here, you'll see this. And then in mobile and on the clocks, if you use either one of those or the kiosk mode, I should mention the kiosk mode as well, those buttons would show. So when I went to go track my time, it would show, as an example, start in, stop out day. If I was already in, it might say out lunch, depending on whatever those things are. So that shows in the mobile app, the kiosk, and the time clocks. All right. And then, of course, it's been a minute, if I go ahead and start it again, it's going to stop that lunch. And there we go. And you'll see here, it did record 2 minutes for my meal break. And I have the situation here where this might have a lunch penalty depending on my rules that apply. So let's see in the summary, do I see that? No, I don't have that. He didn't meet that because he has these other punches and there's gaps in time there. So he didn't actually work 5 consecutive hours. Well, actually, this one did. So I have to look at my rule. Well, the lunch break wasn't happening in here and the things like that. I'll have to look at my rules that are applying to him as to why it didn't calculate. In fact, it's because I changed his overtime rule. If I go back to that San Diego rule for him, it would calculate the lunch break. But you remember I changed the rule in Dallas to be weekly. So that's why it didn't show the lunch penalty. But if I did have that lunch penalty on there, I would see on here lunch penalty or meal penalty or whatever I called it, 1 hour. And then I would see that here. But here you'll see the summary of everything. let me change that rule back to the daily, just so you can kind of see how the system can recalculate. So this is all part of what I would call that the troubleshooting of your overtime and stuff like that. If things are not working the way you're expecting, because you should see overtime or something like that, it's because you maybe have changed your rules or things like that. So in your sandbox, or if you're still in implementation, you may need to hit refresh or save or something like that to get the system to properly calculate that somebody is in an overtime situation. And as well as the summaries are correct right there. All right, so that is, like I said, at a high level, the overtime rules. And there are definitely different situations for how this applies. I do want to mention there are options. I'm going to go to the timesheet layout where you might want to blend the rate. So what this terminology means is if somebody does overtime, they hit overtime, do you want it to spread that overtime across all of the different projects and tasks and things that they did for the period, or should it apply to those hours where they did overtime? So back to my example here, let's just say it was overtime on Thursday here. Whatever is on these things here where he actually hits overtime, that's where it should calculate the overtime. So if it happened to hit right here on this cleanup, they would get charged to cleanup and going forward for those things there. The blended would say, well, look at all of these things here. And he's got Palm, he's got Criterion, Sanitary, Evergreen. I don't know, he's got 5 or 6 different things. Spread all that overtime out over all of these to apply across multiple projects. So we do have that option out there if you need to do the blended overtime across those different things there. One other thing I will mention before we go to the agenda for, or the future, is a couple of things: the start time of the day, the start date of the week, and the start day of the month. So overtime, we're going to look at, in my example, 12 a.m. being the start of the day. So when I say over 8 hours in a day, 12 a.m. would be the start of my day for that situation there. All right. I may allow the person to start before that time, but this is the start time of day. I know that there are many situations where you define the actual day and the time of day that it starts, because perhaps you have people working overnight, you have 24-hour, clocks, people are working all times of the day. You need to define a start time of the day. Same type of thing with the start time of the week. Now, for a weekly one, it's pretty simple because this is the start of the pay period, and the end of the pay period would be Saturday. But if you're doing semi-monthly or monthly, that's important for the overtime week. What is the day of the week where that overtime week starts? If you are doing monthly overtime, the start date of the month is crucial, because this would be when the actual overtime month starts. So these are crucial as far as calculating those things that might cross over. All right, so I do want to mention those. So as I was discussing, of course, this is a very complicated topic. We encourage you to reach out to support our implementation if you do have any questions. If you want to look in the system, of course, you can hit the help and see the help on the timesheet layout or on overtime or income. And this does a great job of showing you, the help on here. And of course, our help center goes into more detail. But I know there's complexity. This was a topic I wanted to cover just to get some of it out there. Reach out to us, help@criterionhcm.com. So let's talk about what's coming up in our future timeline of training. We have 1 more minute to go. All right, so next time, a little bit lighter content. I appreciate everybody who showed up or who's watching this after the fact, that this is very heavy content. Next time, lighter content, ESS widgets and calendars. So if you're ever curious how those are set up and setting up calendars, subscribing to them and so forth, widgets, all those things, we're going to talk about that in a couple of weeks. Then we're going to talk about employee management. So kind of I don't want to say the basics of HR, but some of those things that, hiring and terminations, mass hiring, mass terminations, those types of things, leave of absence, right there in employee management in April. Then we're going to go to deductions Now, in between employee management and deductions is going to be our release webinar. I don't have that on the calendar here because it's not a learning series one, but be on the lookout for that one in about a month or so is our next version on our webinar about that. But this is our learning series one. We will have some training on new things from the webinars starting in May. So look forward to some of those things there. I don't want to give you a peek behind the curtain, but there's some really good things coming in there that you will probably be interested in. So thank you for joining us today. I really appreciate you sticking all the way through. And as I mentioned, if you do have any questions, help@criterionhcm.com is the best way to reach us. You can also, in the help menu, submit a ticket there if you need to. And we'd be happy to answer your questions on overtime or whatever other questions you might have about the system. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you all in a couple of weeks.